Hello and welcome to The Print. I'm Snehesh Alex Philip. Well, Defense Minister Rajnath Singh is currently in the US on a visit where he's met with his counterpart, that is the defense secretary there, and also with the National Security Advisor, the American NSA, Jack Sullivan. Next month, in September, Prime Minister Narendra Modi will be traveling to the US for the UN summit. And a lot is happening between the two sides. And to discuss the Indo-US ties, the trajectory it has taken and the trajectory it will take, I have with me none other than Dhruva Jaishankar, who is the Executive Director of the ORF America. Welcome to The Print, Dhruva.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
As I mentioned, Rajnath Singh is currently there. Prime Minister Narendra Modi is going to visit US next month. It all comes amid the US elections also. In your sense, where do you see, as of now, India-US ties standing?
So, I think, there's been a lot of noise, a lot of commentary about on a lot of the differences and difficulties in the relationship. Some of those exist. I don't think it's, I think that's fair. But I often say that, those differences and difficulties make up a diminishing they take up less and less space in the bilateral discussions. That is, today there's a much better understanding in the US where India's relationship with Russia, Pakistan, India's position on Pakistan, and vice versa as well. I think in India also there's understanding that there's realism on both sides about what the relationship is about, where it will go. Now, that being said, I think the areas of convergence and commonality have really grown quite significantly. And I think a lot of the things that are under discussion today, if you'd said that this was going to, if you told me or somebody else 10 years ago that these were some of the things India and the US would be doing together, I don't think many of us would have believed it. Absolutely. So I think it's grown quite significantly. I'll just highlight three quick things that were done just this week when Rajnath Singh ji was in the US. One was they agreed to liaison officers, Indian liaison officers at US commands. They created an agreement about this, and it's I think going by reports, I think the first one is expected to be at the Special Operations Forces Command in the US, in Florida. Now that's that's a first step. I think it again helps with having Indian liaisons at the Indo-PACOM, obviously, with CENTCOM, which covers the Middle East, West Asia, what we call West Asia and India. So that's one development. The second is a security of supply agreement, or what's SOSA for short. So that I think is important. It's not non-binding, but it creates a framework again for that cooperation. Another thing is a third area, and this has been a big ask on the Indian side, has been cooperation on anti-submarine warfare, and that's a very sensitive issue. The US has been historically very reluctant to work with other countries in that area because some of the technologies involved, even with US allies, we've seen this in the very difficult negotiations around AUKUS, the agreement with Australia, which is undersea warfare is still an area where the US is very sensitive about sharing technology, sharing knowledge with even some of its closest allies and partners. So one agreement that seems to have made progress is on sonobuoys for the Indian Navy. So, I think these are just some of the steps, that were advanced in the last few days, which are indicative of the broader relationship and the trajectory.
I completely agree with you when you said that 10 years ago, if somebody had said that India and US would be collaborating so much, one would not really have believed. But you also mentioned about, tensions, and you said that US understands India's position on Russia. Now, Prime Minister Narendra Modi was in Ukraine where he met with President Zelensky. And this visit came just a month after, Prime Minister Modi's visit to Russia and the now infamous hug, right? Which didn't go down well with the Western powers, especially the US. And we had reports coming in from the US that, they tried to postpone the trip because this was clashing with the NATO meeting that was on. How do you see that? Would these tensions continue to be there? And would these become an irritant a bigger irritant in future?
No, I mean, I think the at least the people in government in the US and I think in other Western capitals are again in an ideal world they from their point of view India and Russia would not have the relationship, but I think they're actually been much more understanding of it than many let out. There's a lot more noise amongst commentators. To give one example, a former US National Security Advisor after that visit by the Prime Minister to Moscow said something like, we need to rethink our relationship with India. He said quite publicly, which I think is going, somewhat overboard and again lacks the kind of historical understanding that one would expect of someone in that position. But broadly, I mean, people in government again are understanding. I think some things just were part of it was the timing that it happened at the same time as the NATO summit, and the US was trying to consolidate support for Ukraine on that very same day as Prime Minister Modi was in Moscow. I think some of it also coincided. There was an attack against a children's hospital
Yeah.
in Ukraine that while the PM was there, by Russian forces while the PM was there, and I think the optics of that were obviously not very positive. I think to some degree, we saw Prime Minister Modi in Ukraine going to the memorial with President Zelensky for children killed in that conflict. So I think some of it was really about the optics of that, but again, I've sensed that generally there's been much more maturity about that on at least in the government in official circles, and a realization that if you look at the substance of the relationship, they understand where it's coming from and that India needs to meet its own national security requirements.
Perfect. You mentioned about the SOSA agreement that was signed, and now I think the next step, I've done a story saying that the next step would be the RDP, which is the Reciprocal Defense Procurement Agreement, which is also in talks. But all of this comes at a time when this is primarily because it will help more industry to industry partnership between India and the US, right? US wants India to move away from Russian defense equipment. But do you think, earlier it was talked about was the three foundational agreements which the Narendra Modi government signed, then one agreement after the other. Do you really think that US can be a credible partner to India, just like how Russia has been?
I would put it slightly differently, which is I think, from India's standpoint of view, India doesn't have India, even the Treaty of Peace and Friendship that India had with the Soviet Union signed in 1971 wasn't sort of a mutual defense treaty as some
True.
people think of. Not to say that it wasn't important. It was critically important during the Bangladesh Liberation War, particularly to keep China out of that conflict, to ensure that the Soviet Union didn't sell arms to Pakistan and things like that. So it was very important at that time, and it arguably necessary from India's point of view. But it wasn't a kind of agreement that there was not an expectation that if India was in trouble, that necessarily you would have Soviet troops come to India's assistance or anything like that, right?
Yeah.
So I think my sense is that in India there's a reasonable explanation that India's national security is ultimately up to India. And it's not that the US is going to come to India's assistance tomorrow if India is in trouble or anybody else for that matter, the Russia, not even the same applied to the Soviet Union in the 70s and 80s. That being said, I think there are indications that there are ways in which India and the US could be useful to each other in a defense and in a security and military context. And we've seen some evidence of that. After 2020, for example, the US did provide certain equipment that India requested after the Galwan clashes and
satellite imagery also.
So intelligence is one area. I often put it in different ways. There's intelligence, interoperability, and the foundational agreements you mentioned are really about interoperability. The third one, which is the most difficult, has been on defense, trade, and technology. And traditionally, that was about India buying platforms whether it's from the US or France or Russia or others off the shelf. And they were looking into licensed production in India. I think the challenge is, I think there's a realization today that India needs to indigenize its own defense industry. That this is any major country has to be self-reliant to a large degree if it is to meet its national security needs. And the challenge, and this is something I and many others have been puzzling over. This has been a quest that India has been on since 1947. This is not new. And so why, despite all of this effort, despite the fact that we have a very strong, in some respects, a very strong defense industry, we have very large, we have very competent companies. Why have we struggled with that? And I think the challenge threading that needle has required India to enter into different kinds of agreements now. So it's no longer about, say, I wouldn't look for what is the next big US sale to India. I don't think that's the interest. The interest is where can India procure in a way that accelerates its own defense indigenization? And that requires a much more complex set of negotiations because today the US government doesn't own that technology. It's a private company that does. So, what will allow them to, what will incentivize them to set up production facilities in India, and slowly lead to a technological transfer to Indian companies, whether they're, public sector PSUs or whether they're private in Indian. I think we're in that stage right now. It's a good stage to be in some ways, because for the first time, India has the capital, even 20 years ago, we were worried about forex reserves.
Yeah.
How do we pay for, so even with Ukraine, and to bring it back to Ukraine, in the early 1990s, we had this challenge where we needed spare parts from Ukraine, and the only way we could do it is through barter, where we didn't have the forex reserves to pay for it. So today, I think we're in a very different stage where we can actually have both the capacity, the technological capacity, and the resources to enable that transfer of technology that is sorely needed for Indian industry.
Do you think that the US is on board when it comes to genuine technology transfer, joint development, and I'm not just talking about joint manufacturing, but joint development and technology transfer?
So I think the US government is, but to different levels. So, they have different, both informally and legally, they have different levels of relationships based on trust and history. So obviously, and not all, even the allies are in the same level.
Absolutely.
So obviously the UK, Australia, Japan are towards the top of that list. Some other NATO allies are a bit behind. You would say Turkey and others are lower down the list.
Yeah.
India today is on par with many non-ally, Israel, Singapore, others. So there is that degree of trust that has built up. And I think from the US government standpoint, they are comfortable sharing that level of technology, which is quite high, but not obviously some of the crown jewels, right? So nuclear propulsion, I think, is a good example that the US doesn't share that with anybody, even some of the closest allies, maybe Canada, UK,
Yeah.
are the few that they share some of those technologies with. So I would say the US government is mostly on board. But the question, I think, this is always a harder challenge, is how do you make the business case? And again, because the technology is owned by private actors, how do you convince them that there's another complication, which is the US has some legacy export control issues. This is
Yeah.
not India specific. I think most of the India specific ones have been overcome over the past 20 years. But they have some other issues that really date back to 70s and 80s, where they've now tied themselves up into knots. And they're at a stage, I mean, again, the AUKUS experience has been an interesting one, illuminating one, because they're at a stage where even when they want to, they cannot share. They've bound themselves so tight that they cannot share technologies with their closest partners in certain ways. So I think those are the issues to overcome today. I think the export control issue for some very sensitive technologies, and again, how to make the business case to private actors.
Now that you mentioned that the US government is generally on board at different levels, that brings me to a question. Does India have enough of bandwidth, or let's say stakes in Washington, D.C.? Or are we not focused yet in building? Because I feel that, whatever deals or whatever cooperation is being done is being sporadic and largely driven by US interests, what US wants from India.
It's funny because I think in the US there's almost a view of it's the opposite way, right? That the US interest has been sporadic and ad hoc, and it's always, it's quite funny because many people always there is a constituency in the US that believes that every US government, every US president for the past 4 or 5 has just folded into Indian demands, has given India everything that India has asked for, from Clinton to. So it's quite funny because I think there is that gap of perception
Yeah.
that again, I get questions all the time from people in the US saying, India has gained so much from this relationship. What do we get in return, right? And so I think maybe that's a mutual, the gap of perceptions. The Again, I think it's been both ways. I think if you look at the best, the most progress has been made when there's a specific ask. So, in 2005, 4, 5, India said, look, we'd like to do more with you, but we can't as long if you have nuclear related sanctions against us.
Yeah.
So how do we resolve that? And that produced a civil nuclear agreement. Similarly, I think on the Indian side, more recently, it has been specific technologies, it's been specific defense equipment. When there's been a specific ask, there has been something to focus upon. One of the challenges, I'll give you an example of where it hasn't gone well. There was something that was set up during the Obama years called DTTI, a
Yeah.
Defense Trade and Technology Initiative.
Yeah.
Now, I think it was well intentioned on both sides, which is we will jointly identify areas where there is a need for both the US and India to co-develop. I mean, this is not co-manufacturing. This will be cutting edge technologies where there's a need to co-develop, and we will jointly develop those things. Now, that hasn't really taken off. I mean, one would say it's almost that initiative is really dead, or close to. There's one current agreement on air launch to UAVs that
Yeah.
is pending, but it's not really in a great state. And part of the reason, there are many reasons for it. I think part of it was just a mismatch in expectations and requirements. Part of it was we didn't really have a way of articulating or identifying what were those cutting edge technologies that both countries, the Venn diagram of what the US wanted and the India wanted, there was not much overlap there. Partly there were some issues on the Indian side on jointness. So with the Air Force, Army, Navy not necessarily agreeing on priorities. So for a variety of reasons that has, and it was also very state to state,
Yeah.
bring in the private sector. What the more recent efforts, which have borne more success, have been so this is where I set is important. It's about bringing the private sector into the conversation at an early stage, so
Yeah.
that we don't get to the point. So that in that front, I think again we've seen quite a bit of takeoff, and I think your article, which I saw a few days ago on Indian defense exports to the US, is indicative of some of those early successes.
True. You know, while we talk about India-US ties, there are many people in India, they're looking very closely at the US elections. Some say that, Trump is a better choice. Some would say that no matter whether it's Kamala Harris or it's Biden, the Democrats have a hangover, and, they want India the way that they want how India should be, right? In your sense, do presidential candidates would really matter who the president is, or is because traditionally it's the establishment or it's the state which has always run the show, right? But Trump is how I would say is a maverick. One doesn't know how he will
Yeah, he's
come.
a wild card. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I think two things. One, relatively speaking, meaning compared to other countries in the world, I don't think the election results matter as much for India as it does for other countries because we're not a US ally. We're not dependent on the US for defense, and we don't get any aid. We do get zero military aid from them, unlike say Israel or Ukraine or others. Yes, this trade is sizable, but the Indian economy is not driven only by trade. I think it's much more diversified, and not just by trade with the US, even though the US is the largest trade partner. So I always say in relative terms, India is less. The outcome will affect India less than most other countries, I would say. That being said, of course, it is important. I would watch out for a few things. I think for Trump, I think the biggest challenge will be the uncertainty, right? Which is this not lack of predictability. You can agree something with his cabinet level advisors, and he will change his mind about it at the last minute. So that did happen, for example, on some trade issues when he was last president. There are also some very specific issues I think that will come up on trade, differences on trade. I think he will use tariffs very readily, mostly against China and but also against India as well. Immigration will be very difficult, and whether it's students, whether it's business visas. I mean, forget about other things. You'll see those frustrations build up. But there are other areas where there's a lot more convergence and commonality, and I see no reason why other efforts such as the Quad or even ISET or the 2+2 dialogue, other like formalized channels of engagement between India and the US will go away. I don't think that's too much of a concern at this point. On Harris, I think Biden had worked out an agreement, a de facto agreement with the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which, to put it very plainly, was let me run foreign policy and the economy, and I will support your social and climate agenda. That was basically what he brokered. For the most part, until the Gaza war, they basically that agreement that held. It remains to be seen whether Kamala Harris is able to negotiate that similar kind of, or whether she wants to or has the capability to negotiate that similar kind of agreement. So that's all a way of saying we may see more of that left-wing progressive agenda come in, seep into the Democratic platform under Harris, maybe. But a lot of it will depend. She doesn't have as strong, Biden was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for 10 years before he became vice president. He had a long history. He had very close advisors like Blinken, the Secretary of State, like Jake Sullivan. Harris doesn't have the same depth of either the people behind her or the experience. So I think she's a bit more of an open book. The key thing for both Trump and Harris, which I would watch out for over the next few months, is how do they approach China? Because how they approach China will actually shape how they approach much of the rest of the world, Russia, India, Europe, the Indo-Pacific, and on some substantive issues as well, like trade, technology policy, industrial policy, and things like that. So that is what I would look for. We've seen mixed messages, to be honest, from both the Republicans and Democrats on that issue. For example, Trump previously wanted to ban TikTok. He's now come around and says he's supportive of that. That's one indication that he has different sets of advisors who he listens to on that. Harris, similarly, I think she's made some mixed statements, but at the convention just a few days ago, she said, again, the U.S. should be the leading power of the 21st century, not China, and things like that. So let's see. But that would be what I would observe. I don't think we'll see major deviations in the relationship either way.
No major deviations in the relationship either way. One last question to you, Dhruva. Whenever I speak to American diplomats, American officials, the whole question of strategic autonomy that India talks about comes into play, right? Like, for example, we have a relationship with the US, we have a relationship with Russia, we also have a relationship with Ukraine, right? The Ukrainian president did make some remarks, after the meet, which one would say one can look at it as being critical of India's stand. But many in the US, when I speak to them, they say that fine, we get your strategic autonomy, but at the end of the day, sooner than later, you will eventually have to pick which side you're on, because it cannot be a one-way street. Eventually, you'll have to choose. Do you think that's something which is there, or India's strategic autonomy continues to be its strength point?
So I think it's just for a lot of American thinkers and commentators and officials to some degree, they came of age during the Cold War or shortly thereafter, during a period of American unipolarity. And for them, they have a very clear understanding of, this was a world of alliances. This was, and they understand, that's where Europe stands, where Japan stands, where Australia stands, because these are allies. But I think part of a more multipolar world, which is a reality today, is that more and more countries, and not just India, are becoming more strategically autonomous. So take an example, Turkey, for example, or Saudi Arabia. And these are countries that used to be very close to the US.
France.
France to some degree, Brazil, and even in Indonesia. So I think when you grapple with the realities of an increasingly multipolar world, you have to acknowledge that these countries will all have their own relationships and their own incentives and their own needs. In India's case, say with Russia, not just defense, but energy security, food security, other things. And so I think getting out of that alliance mindset is something that is slowly happening. To be fair, I think people in the US government dealing with day-to-day issues today understand this much more than those outside of government. Another thing is happening, which is, particularly Trump, and there's a bit of this on the Democratic side as well. they're saying that those old alliances are sometimes they see it as a liability. Why are we, I mean, from their point of view, they are saying, why are we
Yeah.
paying for Europe's defense? Why are they not paying more? These are rich countries, they're wealthy countries, they should be paying for their own defense. And so when they look at a country like India, they say, oh, well, this is actually good. Here's a country that's willing to, you know, pay for its own defense, be you know, help work with us to secure the Indian Ocean and the global commons. They pay for their defense equipment when they buy stuff from us. It's at market rates. We're not giving them any aid. So, you know, this from our point of view, this is a good thing. And on again, on many issues, there's convergence. On some issues, I think there is a need to I don't like the idea of taking sides because I think ultimately the side India is taking is India's own.
Yeah.
But say on issues like technology, I mean, that's where the convergence on China is much greater, right? Which is when you have the shared concerns about between the US and China, the US and India on China, that leads to certain commonalities. Again, we have differences on other issues, Pakistan, Russia, and other things. But if the premise from the US point of view is China is their major competitor, over not just in the near term, but over the next generation. In India, they see, you know, it makes sense that for India, they see in India a valued partner, and a partner, again, even if it is not allied in the formal sense, and even if it is not, even if it has disagreements. So essentially, all of this is a way of saying Indian strategic autonomy should be something the world gets used to, and the world understands a bit better. And I think, if, again, from some quarters in the US, they even see that as an advantage. It's better for us to have a strategically autonomous partner than to have an ally who we are obliged to defend, whose security we have to subsidize in a major way. So that I think is where things stand. But there's still a gap, I think, in sometimes the knowledge and appreciation of this, particularly outside the US government.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dhruva, for speaking to The Print. It's a pleasure, and we will have you more as the election approaches in the US. Thank you so much, Dhruva.
Thank you. Thank you.